It was supposed to be a normal afternoon at the bakery. Children laughing, ovens humming, warm sugar floating in the air. The scent of vanilla and yeast acted as a comfort blanket for the shoppers in the high-end mall, creating a world where hunger felt like a distant, impossible concept. Then the door opened softly, hesitantly. A woman stepped inside, her presence immediately clashing with the sterile luxury of the shop. She wore a worn brown jacket over a layered, faded shirt, and a massive delivery-style backpack was slung over her shoulders, pulling at her posture. Despite the weight she carried, she stood upright, her hand firmly gripping the small, trusting fingers of a girl around 5 years old. The child wore a bright yellow dress that had been washed so many times the fabric was thinning, her dark hair neatly tied in short braids. The mother's eyes were tired, the kind of deep-seated exhaustion life carves into a person over years of surviving on the margins. They stood in front of the display filled with gourmet burgers, glistening brioche buns, and artisan pastries. The little girl looked up at the counter with quiet expectation, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the heat lamps. She whispered, "Mommy, can I pick one?" Kendra swallowed hard, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She leaned toward the cashier, a young woman in a beige apron who had been smiling warmly at the previous customer, and whispered words so soft only 3 people in the room heard them. "Do you maybe have an expired burger? Or any scraps? Just something small. My daughter hasn't eaten since yesterday." The cashier's friendly expression vanished, replaced by a sharp, judgmental frown. Behind Kendra, a few shoppers in designer clothes snickered under their breath, their eyes scanning the delivery bag and the worn jacket with disdain. But someone else heard it too. Sitting in the corner booth, holding a tiny espresso cup in his tattooed hands, was Lee Hyun-woo. He was dressed in a black pinstripe suit that cost more than most people earned in a year, his dark hair slicked back with lethal precision. He was the most feared man in the city's underworld, a man whose rigid posture and stern face usually kept everyone at a distance. He saw the way the little girl tried to hide her disappointment. He saw Kendra pretending not to notice the snickers, and he heard every word clearer than gunfire. The cashier sighed impatiently, her voice loud enough to carry. "No, ma'am. This isn't a charity. We don't give trash to customers." The little girl lowered her head, her hand tightening around her mother's. Kendra blinked fast, holding back tears of shame. Lee Hyun-woo slowly stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the marble floor was like a thunderclap in the sudden silence. The entire bakery froze. He walked over, towering behind them, his shadow falling across the glass display and the friendly worker who was suddenly trembling. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and steady, vibrating with an authority that brooked no argument. Kendra turned, her eyes wide with terror as she recognized him from the news. But instead of anger, there was a strange, haunting sympathy in his eyes. He knelt down to the little girl, ignoring the expensive fabric of his trousers pressing against the floor. He looked at her curious face and her trembling smile and asked gently, "Tell me, sweetheart, what kind of burger do you want for your birthday?" What happened next would change all 3 of their lives forever. Stay with me until the end because what the mafia boss did next shattered everyone's expectations. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. The silence that followed the scraping of Lee Hyun-woo's chair was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. The shoppers who had been snickering moments ago now stared into their expensive lattes, suddenly terrified of their own shadows. The pinstripe-clad man stood tall, his presence an immovable mountain behind Kendra and Lily. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes were fixed on the cashier, who was now trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the wooden counter to stay upright. Hyun-woo reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. With a slow, deliberate movement, he pulled out a roll of bills. He didn't count them. He simply peeled off 4 crisp $100 bills and let them flutter onto the counter. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was like a series of soft slaps to the cashier's face. $400, Hyun-woo said, His voice a low, dangerous velvet that carried to every corner of the shop. That should cover more than just the trash you were discussing. The cashier swallowed hard, her voice coming out in a thin, pathetic squeak. Sir, the register. I don't know if I can. You will make it work, Hyun-woo interrupted, his tone chillingly calm. I want the signature burgers. I want the ones with the gold leaf buns and the imported beef. I want every side you have, truffle fries, onion rings, the works. And I want them made fresh. Right now. He turned his gaze toward a large, plush booth in the center of the bakery, the one usually reserved for the mall's elite. With a slight tilt of his head, he signaled his two silent associates at the door. They moved instantly, standing like stone pillars on either side of the table, clearing the path. Sit, Hyun-woo told Kendra. It wasn't a suggestion, but it wasn't a threat either. It was a command of protection. Kendra hesitated, her hand white-knuckled on the strap of her delivery bag. Sir, I can't take this. I was just looking for a bit of help, not a banquet. I have no way to pay you back. Hyun-woo looked at her then, and for a fleeting second, the coldness in his eyes flickered. He saw the delivery bag, the worn jacket, and the fierce, protective stance she took over her daughter. He saw a woman fighting a war the rest of the mall didn't even know existed. You aren't paying, he said. The trash policy of this establishment has been revoked for the afternoon. He then looked down at Lily, who was peering out from behind her mother's leg, her eyes wide as saucers. He reached out, his tattooed hand hovering for a moment before he gently tucked a stray braid behind her ear. Today, you are the guest of honor, little princess. Eat whatever you want. As the kitchen erupted into a panicked frenzy of activity, the smell of searing meat and toasted brioche began to fill the air. The friendly worker was now scurrying to set the table with the finest linens they had, her hands still shaking. Kendra slowly slid into the booth, letting the heavy delivery bag drop to the floor. As she watched Lily's face light up at the sight of the first steaming plate being brought out, she looked up at the man in the pinstripe suit. Hyun-woo remained standing, a silent guardian in the center of the room, his eyes scanning the windows. He had given them a feast, but his rigid posture suggested that the price of this meal might be higher than either of them yet realized. The massive delivery backpack sat on the floor like a discarded shell, its straps frayed and its heavy-duty fabric stained with the dust of 1,000 different streets. Lily was momentarily lost in the simple, profound joy of a burger that wasn't a cold leftover, her small face lit by the warm glow of the bakery's overhead lights. For a few minutes, the world was only as large as the booth they sat in. Hyun-woo didn't sit, but he moved closer, leaning one hand against the edge of the table. The light caught the jagged lines of the tattoo on his knuckles, a mark of a life built on iron and blood. He looked from the bag to Kendra, his gaze lingering on the red marks the heavy straps had burned into her shoulders. How long? He asked. The question was sparse, but it carried the weight of a man who knew the answer was going to be longer than any human should endure. Kendra didn't look up immediately. She was watching her daughter eat, her own hands trembling as she smoothed a napkin. 8 months, she said, her voice a tired rasp. Since the landlord sold the building in the middle of the night. We've been living out of the car, but the alternator died 3 days ago. Now we just move. She looked at the delivery bag, then back at him, her chin lifting with a flicker of that fierce, defensive pride he had noticed earlier. I work. I take every shift the app gives me. I walk 5-10 miles a day with 30 pounds on my back just to make enough for a motel room or a hot meal. But sometimes the math just doesn't work. Sometimes the city wins. Hyun-woo listened, his face a mask of stone, but internally the ghosts were stirring. As Kendra spoke of the cold nights and the invisibility of poverty, he didn't see a stranger. He saw his own mother. He remembered the smell of damp cardboard and the way she used to wrap her coat around him in a drafty tenement in Busan. Her eyes reflecting the same hollow, haunted exhaustion he saw now in Kendra. He remembered her asking for scraps at the market, her voice shrinking under the weight of her shame. You carry the world on your back, Hyunwoo said softly. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation of a burden he knew too well. I carry her, Kendra corrected, gesturing to Lily. That's the only world that matters. Hyunwoo looked at the little girl in the yellow dress, then back at the delivery bag. The backpack represented the old rules, a system that demanded everything from those who had nothing. He reached out and touched the worn fabric of the bag, his fingers tracing a tear in the side. The road is no place for a child, he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming the low rumble of a predator deciding on a new course. And it is no place for a woman who fights this hard. He signaled to one of his men, who moved forward like a shadow. Forget the bag, Hyunwoo commanded. His eyes locked on Kendra's. You won't be needing it tonight. Or ever again. Kendra's breath hitched. She looked at the man who ruled the city with fear, seeing for the first time that his sternness wasn't a lack of feeling, but a shield for a memory that was still bleeding. At that moment, the delivery bag on the floor seemed like a relic of a past life they were both ready to leave behind. The black sedan glided through the rain-slicked streets of the city like a silent predator, the neon lights of the district bleeding across its polished surface. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of expensive leather, a stark contrast to the damp, biting wind Kendra had fought for months. Lily had fallen into a deep, heavy sleep against her mother's side, her small face finally free of the tension that had become her constant companion. Kendra, however, remained rigid, her eyes darting toward the stoic profile of Lee Hyunwoo. He stared out the window, his tattooed hand resting motionless on his knee, the very image of a man who owned the shadows they passed through. They pulled up to a high-rise complex that stood like a fortress of glass and steel. It was a place Kendra had delivered to a dozen times, always stopped by a stern doorman at the service entrance, always made to feel like a ghost in the presence of such wealth. But tonight, the gates swung wide before they even reached them. Hyunwoo led them through a marble lobby that swallowed the sound of their footsteps. He didn't speak until they reached the 12th floor. The hallway was silent, lined with heavy mahogany doors that whispered of privacy and power. He stopped at the very end and produced a single weighted key. It wasn't silver or brass. It was a deep, brushed gold, catching the overhead light with a dull, authoritative glow. He pressed it into Kendra's hand. Her skin felt rough and calloused against the cool metal. Apartment 12, he said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet hall. The locks are reinforced steel. The windows are tempered. In this building, the world cannot reach you unless I allow it. When the door swung open, the scent of cedar and fresh linen drifted out. It wasn't just an apartment. It was a sanctuary. The living room was bathed in the soft, amber glow of recessed lighting, revealing plush carpets and furniture that looked untouched by the wear of the world. In the kitchen, the counters were polished stone, and the pantry was already stocked with the kinds of things Kendra had spent months trying to budget for. Milk, fruit, bread that wasn't day-old. Hyunwoo walked to the center of the room, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He pointed toward a door down the hall. There is a bedroom for the girl. The blankets are wool, and the heating is internal. She will not wake up cold tonight. Kendra walked to the window, looking out at the city below. From this height, the streets looked like a map of a war she was no longer fighting. She turned back to him, her voice trembling, nearly breaking. Why? You don't even know our names. You're a man who people. They say you don't do things for free. Hyunwoo didn't flinch at the accusation. He stood by the door, his hand on the handle, half submerged in the shadows of the hallway. Consider it an investment in a debt that was paid a long time ago, he said, his eyes reflecting a flicker of that ancient shared sorrow. Sleep, Kendra. The door is heavy for a reason. As he stepped out and the lock engaged with a heavy metallic thud, Kendra finally let out the breath she had been holding for 8 months. She carried the sleeping Lily to the warm bed, tucking her under blankets that felt like a cloud, knowing that for the first time, the golden key in her pocket was a promise that the morning would bring peace instead of a climb. While the warmth of apartment 12 offered a rare, silent sanctuary for Kendra and Lily, a different kind of silence filled a cold, sterile office across the city. It was the silence of a predator watching a recording. The room was bathed in the flickering blue light of a wall-mounted monitor, where the grainy surveillance footage from the bakery played on a continuous loop. Choi Jin-hyuk sat behind a desk of polished obsidian, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He was a man of sharp angles and even sharper ambitions, a rival who had spent years waiting for a single crack to appear in Lee Hyun-woo's ironclad reputation. On the screen, the moment of the mistake played out again. Hyun-woo, the man who had once burned down a warehouse over a stolen shipment, was kneeling on a bakery floor, tucking a strand of hair behind a little girl's ear. Jin-hyuk leaned forward, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He didn't see an act of kindness. He saw a structural failure. In his world, empathy was a blood trail that led straight to the throat. "So, the dragon finally has a soft underbelly," Jin-hyuk whispered, his voice like dry leaves skittering over pavement. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. His top lieutenant, a man whose only purpose was to facilitate his boss's cruelty. "He moved them into the 12th Street complex, sir. High security. He's assigned 2 of his personal details to the lobby." Jin-hyuk tapped the screen, right where Lily's bright yellow dress created a splash of defiant color against the bakery's marble. "Security is only as strong as the man behind it. Hyun-woo thinks he's protecting them, but all he's done is build a cage and hand me the location. He's forgotten the most basic rule of our trade. Never give your enemy something to love. Makes you predictable. It makes you slow." He stood up, walking to the window that looked out over the sprawling skyline. Somewhere out there, tucked away in a high-rise sanctuary, a mother and daughter were sleeping, believing they were finally safe. They didn't know that their faces were now pinned to a digital board, targets in a game they hadn't asked to play. "He thinks he's paying a debt to his past," Jin-hyuk continued, his reflection in the glass looking ghostly and thin. "But he's just opened a line of credit he can't afford to settle. Watch them. Don't move yet. I want him to get comfortable. I want him to believe they are truly his to keep. The higher the hope, the more devastating the fall." He hit the stop button on the remote, and the image of Lily's smiling face vanished into a black void. The room returned to total darkness, save for the glowing red record light of the security system, a silent eye that never blinked. The war for the city had just found a new, vulnerable front, and for Choi Jin-hyuk, the scent of blood was already in the air. The sunlight that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of apartment 12 the following morning felt like a foreign substance, bright, unapologetic, and warm. Kendra sat at the polished oak dining table, her hands wrapped around a porcelain mug of coffee. She had slept in a bed for the first time in months, yet her body felt more rigid than it had on the car seat. The silence of the luxury suite was broken only by the soft clinking of a spoon as Lily ate a bowl of fresh fruit in the kitchen, her laughter ringing out like a small silver bell. When the heavy front door opened, Lee Hyun-woo stepped inside. He had traded his pinstripe jacket for a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink that spiraled down his forearms. He placed a thick, unmarked envelope on the table in front of Kendra. "Expenses," he said simply. "For clothes, school supplies for the girl, and whatever else you've been denied." Kendra looked at the envelope, then slowly pushed it back across the smooth surface. Her jaw was set, and the tired lines around her eyes sharpened with a sudden, fierce intensity. "I told you yesterday, Mr. Lee. I don't take charity. We are grateful for the roof, and I'll find a way to pay you back for the burgers, but I won't be a kept woman in a gilded cage." Hyun-woo paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Most people in this city trembled when he spoke. Fewer still had the nerve to reject his gifts. He saw the way she gripped her mug, her knuckles white, a woman who had nothing left but her dignity, holding onto it like a lifeline in a riptide. "It's not a handout," Hyun-woo countered, his voice dropping into that low, resonant rumble. "It's an advance. I don't give something for nothing, Kendra. It's bad for business." He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his presence commanding the space between them. I own 6 of these residential complexes in this district alone. My current logistics and delivery managers are inefficient. They don't understand the city the way someone who has walked every inch of it does. They don't know the shortcuts, the service entrances, or the way the pulse of these streets actually beats. He leaned forward, his tattooed hand resting on the table. I need someone to manage the internal distribution and vendor relations for these buildings. Someone who knows the value of a delivery and the cost of a delay. The salary is high because the expectations are higher. You'd be an employee, not a guest. Kendra searched his face, looking for the trap, the hidden catch that usually came with men of his stature. But she only saw a cold, pragmatic respect. He wasn't offering her a favor. He was offering her a weapon to fight her way back into the world. A job, she whispered, the word feeling heavy on her tongue. A career, he corrected. You start on Monday. Envelope stays. It's your first week's pay and your relocation bonus. If you want to earn your keep, you'll be in my office at 8 a.m. sharp. Kendra looked toward the kitchen, where Lily was tracing patterns in the condensation on the fridge door. For the first time, the weight in Kendra's chest wasn't from a delivery bag, but from the realization that she didn't have to carry it alone anymore. She reached out and pulled the envelope back toward her. 8 a.m., she said, her voice steady. I won't be late. Hyun-woo nodded, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face before he stood to leave. He had preserved her pride, but as he stepped back into the hallway, his mind shifted back to the shadows. He had given her a job, but now he had to make sure she lived long enough to do it. The quiet of the afternoon in apartment 12 was heavy, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the hush of a home finding its heartbeat. While Lily napped in her new room, surrounded by soft wool and the security of thick walls, Kendra found herself tidying the living area, an old habit of a woman who had spent months ensuring her few possessions were packed tight and ready to move. As she dusted the mahogany bookshelf that lined the far wall, her hand caught on the edge of a small, silver frame tucked behind a collection of leather-bound volumes. It was hidden, as if its owner wanted it close enough to reach but too far for any casual eye to see. Curiosity, tempered by a strange sense of reverence, compelled her to pull it into the light. Inside the frame was an old, grain-filtered photograph, the edges yellowed and brittle. It wasn't a picture of a mafia kingpin or a man of power. It was a photo of a woman with dark, determined eyes and a face that looked like a map of hard-won battles. She was standing in a cramped, dimly lit kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, wearing a worn jacket that looked strikingly similar to the one Kendra had just retired to the back of the closet. Clinging to her leg was a young boy with a stubborn chin and a fierce, protective gaze. A young Lee Hyun-woo. Kendra's breath hitched as she traced the woman's face. The exhaustion was there, etched into the corners of her mouth, the same bone-deep weariness Kendra saw in her own reflection every morning. The woman in the photo wasn't just a mother. She was a survivor who had clearly fought to keep her child fed in a world that offered her nothing but scraps. In that moment, the mystery of Hyun-woo's sudden, overwhelming generosity unraveled. He hadn't seen a delivery driver in the bakery. He had seen a ghost. He hadn't helped Kendra because he was a saint. He had helped her because he was still that little boy in the photograph, helplessly watching his mother wither under the weight of the world. He was trying to change the ending of a story that had already concluded for him. She looks like you, a low voice rumbled from the doorway. Kendra jumped, nearly dropping the frame. Hyun-woo stood there, his pinstripe jacket over his arm, his shadow stretching across the plush carpet. He didn't look angry that she had found it. He looked vulnerable, a crack finally appearing in his obsidian armor. The way she held her shoulders, he continued, walking into the room with a slow, heavy gait. The way she never asked for anything until she had no choice. When you asked for that burger, it was like the last 20 years disappeared. I realized I finally had the power to give her the answer she deserved back then. Kendra looked from the photo to the man who ruled the city's darkness. The fear she had initially felt for him dissolved, replaced by a profound, aching understanding. He wasn't her master, and she wasn't his charity case. They were two people who had been forged in the same fire, separated only by time and the choices made in the heat of the flames. "Thank you, Lee," she said softly, using his name for the first time. He didn't respond with words. He simply took the frame, tucked it back into its hiding place, and turned toward the window. The ghost had been acknowledged, and for now, the silence in the apartment was one of shared secrets and a bond that went far deeper than a golden key. The piece of apartment 12 was a fragile glass ornament, beautiful and still, until the moment it shattered. It happened at 3:14 a.m., not with a bang, but with the absence of sound. The steady hum of the air conditioning died, and the digital clock on the microwave blinked once before fading into a black void. Kendra, whose senses had been honed by months of sleeping in a car with one eye open, sat bolt upright in bed before the silence could even settle. She didn't reach for a light. She knew instinctively that the darkness was intentional. Creeping toward the window, she looked out at the hallway. The emergency floor lights, which should have been a reassuring red, were dead. Down in the lobby, the two silent shadows Hyunwoo had posted were no longer visible on the internal monitor. A soft thunk echoed from the service elevator, the sound of a magnetic lock being bypassed. Kendra's blood turned to ice. She wasn't a soldier, but she was a mother, and she knew the city well enough to recognize when the hunters had found their mark. She sprinted to Lily's room, lifting the sleeping girl with a hand over her mouth to stifle any surprised cry. "Lily, baby, it's a game. Remember the hide-and-seek game," Kendra whispered, her voice trembling but urgent. She tucked the girl into the deep cedar-lined closet behind a row of heavy coats, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. In the living room, a shadow detached itself from the doorway. Kendra gasped, reaching for a heavy glass vase, until a hand clamped over her wrist, firm but familiar. The moonlight caught the sharp glint of a pinstripe vest and the dark ink on a tattooed hand. "They're already on the floor," Hyunwoo breathed, his voice a ghost of a sound. He was holding a sleek, silenced pistol, his eyes scanning the door with the predatory focus of a man who had spent his life in the kill zone. Jin Hyuk's men. "They didn't come for the building's logistics, Kendra. They came for the weakness I brought here." "I'm not a weakness," Kendra hissed back, her fear sparking into a cold, protective rage. "Prove it," Hyunwoo countered. He pressed a small, heavy object into her hand, the backup radio. "The service corridors you used to deliver through. They connect to the ventilation shaft behind the kitchen. If I can't hold the door, you take Lily and you go down. Don't look back." Suddenly, the heavy mahogany door groaned. A thin red laser dot danced across the wall, searching for a heart to stop. The sanctuary had vanished. The plush carpets and gold leaf accents were now just obstacles in a battlefield. Hyunwoo stepped into the center of the room, a silhouette of lethal grace, as the first flashbang detonated in the hallway. The silent night was over, replaced by the rhythmic, terrifying pulse of a siege. For the next 17 minutes, the only thing standing between Lily and the dark was a man who ruled through fear and a mother who had finally found something worth fighting for. The walls of apartment 12, once a promise of peace, were now the only shield in a world that had come to reclaim its debt in blood. The first bullet shattered the mahogany door, a splintered herald of the violence to follow. The room, once a sanctuary of amber light and soft linens, dissolved into a chaotic landscape of strobe light flashes and the acrid scent of gunpowder. Hyunwoo didn't flinch. He moved with the terrifying fluid grace of a man who had spent a lifetime dancing in the dark, his suppressed pistol coughing rhythmic metallic sparks. "Kendra! The vents now!" he barked, his voice cutting through the roar of a second breaching charge. But Kendra wasn't running. She was crouched behind the heavy oak dining table, her eyes wide but fixed. She knew this building better than the men trying to kill them. She had studied the blueprints of every luxury complex she'd delivered to, memorizing the service shafts and the blind spots where security cameras failed. If we go to the vents, they'll trap us in the shaft, she yelled back over the percussion of a window shattering. The service elevator has a manual bypass behind the pantry. They won't expect us to go down into the garage. Hyun-woo glanced at her, a brief moment of appraisal flashing in his eyes. He realized then that he hadn't just saved a victim. He had recruited a partner who knew the terrain of the city's hidden veins. Do it, he commanded, laying down a curtain of cover fire toward the hallway. Kendra dove into the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She moved with the frantic precision of a mother whose world was compressed into the four walls of a closet down the hall. She reached Lily just as the front door was kicked off its hinges. In one fluid motion, she scooped the small girl into her arms, pressing Lily's face into her neck to muffle the sounds of the struggle. Stay small, Lily. Stay like a mouse, Kendra whispered into her ear. Hyun-woo stepped into the kitchen, his pinstripe vest torn, blood blooming like a dark rose on his white sleeve. He didn't stop to check the wound. He stood at the pantry entrance, his body a literal shield between the gunman in the living room and the mother and child. Open it, he roared. Kendra's fingers fumbled with the hidden latch behind the shelves, a trick she'd learned from a disgruntled maintenance worker months ago. With a heavy groan of metal, the back wall slid open, revealing a narrow, unlit service passage. Go, Hyun-woo said, stepping back into the passage and pulling the door shut just as a hail of bullets shredded the kitchen cabinets. The darkness was absolute, but Kendra didn't hesitate. She led the way through the narrow concrete throat of the building, her feet knowing the distance between the pipes and the cables. Hyun-woo followed, his breathing heavy but steady, his pistol still pointed back at the door they'd just left. In the claustrophobic heat of the shaft, the roles had shifted. Hyun-woo was the shadow, the lethal force keeping the hunters at bay, but Kendra was the shield, the guide leading them through the bowels of the fortress. They reached the manual lift, a rusted iron cage that hummed with ancient electricity. As Kendra pulled the lever, she looked at the man beside her. He was covered in the dust of the siege, but the look he gave her was one of profound, grim respect. They were no longer the good bad guy and the delivery lady. They were the only two people Lily had left, and together, they were making the city pay for every inch of ground it tried to take. The morning after the siege didn't break with the usual indifference of the city. Instead, it arrived with a cold, sharp clarity. The rain had washed the soot from the pavement, but the air around the 12th Street complex remained charged, thick with the scent of spent brass and the lingering weight of an empire shifting on its axis. In the center of the district's plaza, beneath the towering shadows of the luxury high-rises, Lee Hyun-woo stood alone. He no longer wore the pinstripe jacket. His white shirt was stained with dried salt and a ghost of the blood from the night before. His sleeves rolled up to expose the tattoos that marked him as a king of the underworld. Before him, forced to their knees on the cold concrete, were the survivors of Choi Jin-hyuk's hit squad. They were broken men, stripped of their weapons and their bravado, looking up at Hyun-woo with the wide, vacant eyes of those who had looked into the abyss and realized it was looking back. A crowd had gathered at the edges of the square, shopkeepers, delivery drivers, and mothers clutching their children's hands. They watched in a terrifying, expectant silence. They had spent years paying the tax of fear, expecting the same old cycle of violence to claim another victim. Hyun-woo didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he looked at his men, then at the crowd, his voice carrying through the plaza like a low, resonant bell. Choi Jin-hyuk thought he found a weakness in these streets, he began, his gaze sweeping over the onlookers. He thought that a mother trying to feed her child was a target. He thought that a little girl in a yellow dress was leverage. He stepped toward the lead assassin, his shadow engulfing the man. He was wrong. What he found wasn't a weakness. It was the new line of the law. My law. He looked up at the windows of the apartment complex where Kendra and Lily were safe behind reinforced glass. From this moment on, this neighborhood is a no-predator zone. We are done squeezing the people who have nothing. We are done making enemies of the families who live in our shadows. If you want to hunt, you hunt the wolves, not the sheep. If any of you, or anyone from the rival syndicates, lays a finger on a worker, a child, or a family in this district, you won't be answering to the police. You'll be answering to the man who burned the Jin Hyuk name out of the history books last night. With a dismissive wave of his hand, his lieutenants dragged the captives away, disappearing into the dark mouths of waiting sedans. The threat hadn't just been eliminated. It had been dismantled and used as a foundation for a new order. Hyunwoo turned and walked toward the bakery where it had all started. The friendly worker was there, standing behind the glass, her face pale. He didn't say a word as he walked past, but the rigid posture of his back told the story. The good bad guy had claimed his territory, not through the blood of the innocent, but by becoming their shield. As the crowd began to disperse, a strange thing happened. For the first time in a generation, the people didn't look at the ground. They looked at each other, and then they looked up, finally breathing the air of a city that was no longer a hunting ground. The passage of time had been kind to the corner of the city that Lee Hyunwoo had once claimed with blood and a promise. The neighborhood, once a landscape of shuttered windows and hushed voices, was now a vibrant tapestry of life. The bakery, formerly a place of cold glass and colder hearts, had been transformed into a warm haven of amber light and the scent of toasted brioche. It was no longer a place where trash was discussed, but a cornerstone of a community that had learned to stand tall. Kendra stepped out of a sleek, dark SUV, her movements possessing a fluid confidence that had long ago replaced the defensive rigidity of her delivery days. She wore a tailored suit, the mark of a woman who had spent years successfully managing the logistics of an empire that now built housing instead of fear. Beside her walked Lily, no longer the tiny girl in the thinning yellow dress. She was a young woman now, wearing a graduation gown draped over her arm, her eyes bright with the fire of a future that was entirely hers to write. They entered the bakery, the bell chiming a familiar, welcoming melody. The staff, diverse and smiling, nodded in respectful greeting, not out of fear but out of a shared history. In the corner booth, the same one where a life-changing choice had been made over an espresso cup years ago, sat Lee Hyunwoo. His hair was silvered at the temples now, and the tattoos on his hands had faded into the skin like old maps, but his eyes remained sharp, twin pools of dark ink that missed nothing. He didn't stand as they approached. He simply watched them with the quiet, profound satisfaction of an architect looking at a finished masterpiece. "You're late," he grumbled, though the edges of his voice were soft, lacking the lethal rasp of the past. "The graduation ceremony ran long," Lily said, sliding into the booth across from him with the easy familiarity of a niece. She reached out and touched his hand, the same hand that had once held a pistol to protect her sleep. "I wouldn't miss this meal for anything, Uncle Lee." Kendra sat beside her daughter, looking at the man who had seen the ghost of his mother in her tired eyes. "The usual?" she asked. Hyunwoo signaled the counter. Within minutes, the table was covered. There were no expired scraps or whispered pleas. Instead, there were 3 signature burgers, steaming and perfect, and a mountain of fries that smelled of salt and victory. As they ate, the conversation drifted through stories of school, business, and the quiet peace of the district. Hyunwoo mostly listened, a silent sentinel who had traded his war for this, the simple, extraordinary sound of Lily's laughter. He looked at the graduation cap resting on the table and then at the window, where the city moved on, unaware of the debt that had been settled in this very room. He had started that day years ago as a man looking for a refund on a haunted past. He ended it as a man who had realized that some investments don't return in currency, but in the sight of a child growing up without ever knowing the taste of trash. As the sun set, casting long golden shadows across the booth, the good bad guy finally let out a long, slow breath. The ledger was clean. The girl was safe. And for the first time in a lifetime of shadows, the light was enough.